We have really an excellent panel for you today, and it really couldn't be more timely. We, of course, planned our panel so that it would be the day after the SEC staff released the examination priorities for 2021. And of course, what that meant is we've spent the past 24 hours completely changing our program to deal with it. Seriously, there's a lot of continuity in the program, and we decided today to focus on a set of issues that have arisen over the past year that we also think will likely to be continuing into the future. And to help discuss both what these trends mean and tips for preparing for them, we really have an expert group with us here today. So first, I'm Mark Perlow. I'm a partner in the financial services group in the Dechert law firm with an investment advisor focused practice. But more importantly, I want to introduce to you my co-panelists. First, we have Kristen Snyder, also based in San Francisco, but really she's a national figure. She's the deputy director of the Division of Examinations, and she's the director of the Investment Advisor Investment Company Examination Program at the SEC. We also have with us Anil Abraham, who has over 12 years of experience as a senior attorney at the SEC, including serving as counsel to 2 SEC chairmen and to 2 additional SEC commissioners, and had a variety of roles in the Enforcement Investment Management Division. Anil's role now is he's the Associate General Counsel and a Managing Director at Focus Financial Partners. And finally, we have my old friend, Michelle Jacko, who is the Managing Partner and CEO of Jacko Law Group and the founder and CEO of Core Compliance and Legal Services, Inc., and really a figure you probably all know because of the experience and wisdom she's brought to the compliance community over the years. So I really want to start by thanking my co-panelists here today. I think you're going to hear some very useful and interesting tips and insights from them. So let's get going to our first topic. Should not be a surprise that the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a major subject of the SEC's examination program, and at a more practical level, something all of us have dealt with in both our professional and personal capacities. So we'd like to talk about both how this has affected the way the division has gone about doing its work, but also what the division has been focusing on in examinations of investment advisors. So, Kristin, can you please just start by giving us an overview to tell us about how the division has adapted to the pandemic and the remote work environment?
Absolutely. And good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're sitting. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you again for inviting me to participate in the program. I'm sure you've heard this disclaimer from other SEC panelists, but I'll just quickly give the SEC disclaimer that any of the remarks I make today are my own, and they don't necessarily reflect the viewpoints held by my colleagues at the Commission, our SEC commissioners, or the Commission itself. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I know Pete Driscoll spoke on the prior panel and touched a little bit on how we pivoted during the pandemic. And I first and foremost want to say, we're incredibly proud of our staff. I think we had some experience with remote work, and we've been in a fully remote posture really since, I can't believe it's coming up on a year, but for almost a year now. And so it's only in very rare circumstances that we would not be doing remote examinations. But our staff really pivoted very well. They had experience, about 30% of our exams, I think pre-pandemic, were done by correspondence, so where we wouldn't necessarily go on site. But with going to completely remote work, I think, as we transitioned in March, we tried to get a sense from our registrant community and find out how firms were transitioning. Oh, I apologize. I think I'm the last person alive who actually has a landline.
Right. Red alert, examination emergency.
Yeah, right. So, we did a number of outreach, actually hundreds of outreach calls to firms as the pandemic first unfolded, really to find out how firms were transitioning with their business continuity planning, as well as to talk to firms who may be experiencing, distress due to some of the market events. And we found that I think similar to our staff, the firms were transitioning very well to this new remote environment. I think there was a lot in the beginning that we were trying to put into place at the SEC, and I think firms were as well, as we thought through different processes that typically were done manually, picking up the mail, picking up checks that were sent into, to firms. But again, I think, and there may have been certain systems, just as we have certain essential personnel who are, kind of physically sitting in offices right now, very small group. I think we heard from firms that they may as well, but I think for the most part, folks were able to pivot to kind of a remote environment well, and exams have gone well. I think just some tips in terms of conducting examinations, for some of our more complex exams, it was generally easier to sit across the table if we had a lot of documents to talk to a firm about during the exam process. But I think what's been helpful is just pre-planning, so before an interview, determining which documents may be used so that everybody can have them in front of them, working out, just like we did for the conference today, working out which video conference platform might work, because it has been very helpful to maintain, kind of a face-to-face presence where possible on our examinations. And then just being patient, I think patient with each other. We definitely provided additional time, and particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, if firms needed additional time to produce records or respond to deficiency letters, that's still an option. I think, again, we've seen a really good pivot by the industry. So we're getting back to normal in terms of our processes. But if firms need extra time, certainly for health and safety reasons or other reasons, we've been very open to that. And the outreach that we conducted, we were able to do jointly with our partners in the policy divisions at the SEC. And so we, on the investment advisor side, we partnered, a great deal with our colleagues in the Division of Investment Management as we reached out to firms. And I think, some of those outreaches really helped drive some of the regulatory relief that you saw a lot at the beginning of the pandemic. And then we also tried to take the information that we were gathering and get it out to the industry. And so in August of 2020, and I think it's referenced on the slide, we published a risk alert that covered both broker-dealers and investment advisors and some of the particular risks or issues that we thought could be heightened in light of the pandemic. Some of the issues that are referenced, issues around fees, expenses, those are things that we, would highlight even outside of the pandemic. But I think it was helpful just to kind of get some of the learning that we were gaining through our examinations as well as the outreach and put it into the risk alert just to, make sure that firms were focused on different issues. I mentioned before, some of the manual processes that may have had to be changed. And I think firms were kind of updating some of their policies and practices a bit on the fly as they adjusted to the remote environment. And we did find in some instances that firms had thought through and had in place pandemic-specific policies. We certainly didn't expect that to be widespread, but we did find that a number of firms had those policies and procedures in place. I would imagine many firms have thought that through a bit more since then. But, had a number of the areas that I think just from practical standpoint about how to work in remote locations, how supervision would be conducted. But I think, again, firms, given that we're almost a year into this now, have really started to think that through and updated policies and procedures around business continuity.
Sure, Kristen. I can tell you, I've experienced vicariously a handful of examinations that clients have gone through in the past year. And I can confirm, after an initial period when people were trying to figure out the mechanics of doing remote examinations, the whole thing settled into a groove pretty quickly. And by mid to late next year, it almost, not quite, but almost felt like this was the normal way of doing things. Certainly, it seemed on the other end like it was a full bore examination. Your staff did an admirable job in adapting to the circumstances. And I think importantly, I've generally seen flexibility from the staff on things like document delivery and providing people for interviews as well. So with that in mind, Michelle, you've been helping your clients also the past year deal with this environment and the prospect of SEC examinations. What have they been seeing, and what insights can you offer the audience to help think about it going forward?
Yeah, Mark, and thank you. I think this first bullet point that you have under the COVID-19 compliance risks on supervision of personnel, I want to applaud the financial industry. Unlike so many other industries, we were a lot more prepared because of business continuity plans and thinking about teleworking, because now it is the new norm. I think that, we were much better prepared. I think that the challenges that I saw, at least at the outset of COVID, is that many firms did not anticipate an entire workforce going remote. So they had to start using more and more personal devices and relying upon that for a business purpose. And so then it became a challenge of, okay, have we adequately communicated the safeguards that have to be in place? How are we maintaining books and records that have business communications? How are we going to keep track of things such as, the way that we're going to shift our sales and marketing practices? Because now if we can't meet clients face to face, we have to do it via social media, video teleconference, and what are we doing internally to ensure that those safeguards are in place? And I think that the other thing that, as Kristen mentioned, kind of caught folks by surprise, there was training and education that was occurring. But what wasn't necessarily occurring at the same time was updating the business continuity plan. So it was almost retroactively, let's go back and think about what have we done, how have we done it, and how are we memorializing that? Because if we have to demonstrate to the staff, these are the steps we've taken during COVID-19, it might not all be documented at once. And so it was a little bit going back and trying to make sure that we've really done a look back to see what were the challenges that we've had, both from a technological perspective as well as the supervisory compliance program. And, just by way of example, annual reviews, normally we would walk around the firm, we'd interview folks, we'd look at books and records. Now I have to rely on video teleconferences and having folks demonstrate that while they're working out of their homes, various controls and things of that nature. So it's just, I think that was the biggest challenge, is really documenting what we've done and how we've adapted to that teleworking environment.
All very interesting and very consistent with my client's experience. I think the first step was just the business continuity planning, making sure that the technology was literally in place for people to work from home. And then as people got up and running, they started to focus on the other issues here. And they realized we have a whole new cybersecurity environment. How do we protect all this sensitive information that's now out of the office? And how do we actually supervise people when we're not seeing them now? So those, it's not an accident that those are the issues that the staff chose to focus on in the risk alert. But I think I'm with you, Michelle. This is an industry that's highly technology oriented, and one where a lot of people were traveling or remote working already. So to a large degree, the infrastructure was in place, and it was a matter of adjusting rather than inventing from whole cloth. Anil, from where you sit, you have a unique perspective, both from having high-level positions at the SEC and also your current position where Focus has a number of RI subsidiaries. How have your colleagues in the various operating units been adapting to COVID-19 as a compliance environment?
Well, just as some helpful context, Focus has approximately 60 or just over 60 registered investment advisors in our family. So we do have something of a cross-section of the industry, and we do have small firms and large firms of different shapes. So we got, certainly the firms responded differently depending on how well they happen to be prepared for this. I don't think anybody was fully prepared for this, but there were firms that were sort of more forward-looking and thinking about flexible work environments, working from home, working on the go, and those firms certainly adapted to a full-time work from home environment more easily. But even the firms that were more tied to the office physically and were more philosophically inclined to have people come into the office adapted quickly, I think, just because of the severity of the situation. And really the only hitch was getting the physical hardware. Once people had the physical hardware in place, everything else fell into place. And it is difficult when you can't meet with your clients, or your prospects. It's not the same. But everybody's in the same group. So I think they did as well as could be expected under the circumstances.
So one final question on this subject I want to throw back to you, Kristin. It comes from the audience, and we'll move to the next topic. So the question is, does the staff have any expectations as to when you're going to be able to move back to in-person examinations?
It's a great question, and I don't have an answer to that. I think, we're obviously monitoring all the state and local guidelines around, COVID-19, and our staff's health and safety and the health and safety of the registrant community are really our number one priorities. And so I think, there will probably be a government-wide discussion about when employees are allowed to return to work. And we're in sort of a unique position in the exam program because we're not just inviting folks into the building to meet with us. As you point out, we go out into the world and meet with registrants. And so I think we'll have to take a careful approach, as we go back. We still have the ability, in rare circumstances, if a cause situation were to come up, we would work through those issues, of course, right now. But I think on a widespread basis, there are a lot of variables and factors that I'm sure firms are considering as well. Getting on an airplane, to do our work, and just a lot of logistics to think through. But we're not there yet. But I know that there's a lot of thought being given to it.
Sure. I'm going to stick my neck out and not put Kristin on the spot and say, my bet is that the staff learns many of the same lessons that we do. And going forward, work to a much greater degree is going to be a hybrid between in-person and the remote technology. There's no way to unlearn the lessons of how much you can actually accomplish with remote technology. And I suspect the staff will be creative in using it just as much as the rest of us in the industry will. So let's go to the next subject, which is, of course, everybody's favorite SEC Form CRS. We had a deadline last year. This is, of course, part of the Reg BI fiduciary interpretation rulemaking, short client relationship summary that was intended, I say only half facetiously, to take 20 pages and summarize it in two pages. So, the challenge, of course, for the industry, and we saw this with all our clients, was trying to meet the spirit of the form and give the essential information that the SEC wanted in the format the SEC wanted, in a user-friendly way, but not at the same time sell yourself short or leave out key points. And I'd say it's fair to say that SEC examinations to a certain degree have focused on these particular questions. The staff did conduct examinations that focused in part on Form CRS. They published a risk alert last year. They gave us some of the lessons, and it shouldn't be surprising. A lot of what they were focusing on was content, formatting, how you were updating, but also as simple things as whether you were filing and delivering on time. So, Kristin, perhaps you can summarize what you think are some of the more interesting takeaways here for the audience.
Absolutely. And I think Pete may have touched on this a bit as well, but you hit on an interesting point. We did have a regulatory roundtable back in October where we talked through some of our initial findings and thoughts around some of the Form CRS filings that we had viewed, as well as some of the Reg BI and Form CRS exams that we had conducted. And kind of coming out of that roundtable, or around the time of the roundtable, we also contacted firms. There were hundreds of firms actually who hadn't filed their form at all. And so we engaged in outreach to those firms to just ask the question, they appeared to, for the firms who appeared to have the demographic required to file, why the filing hadn't happened. And there were a number of firms who did file after receiving that informal outreach, but there were some who did not. And so we've initiated exams for the firms that failed to file. So if you fall into that category and have retail investors and should be filing the form, you may expect to see us on an examination to follow up on that. Another area that we touched on during the roundtable, I think, and then is also one of our efforts this year, particularly in the investment advisor program, is to look at firms where the firm may have inappropriately marked no on the disciplinary history question, either for the firm or its financial professionals. And so we are also doing some follow-up work there. And then I think just like we look at Form ADV Part 2, in all of our examinations, with the exams of retail firms, it's as part of background, we'll be taking a look at the Form CRS. And then we are also conducting another initiative that has some other retail focuses where we're also focused on Form CRS. And so we are looking, as to your point, to kind of the basics on content to determine if there's any omissions, of required information from the form, to ensure that there's a consistent presentation of the information so that investors can make an informed decision by looking, comparing apples to apples in essence between firms with their Form CRSs. And then at the regulatory roundtable, we reminded folks just about the requirements and the information that we put out as part of the fiduciary interpretation, which wasn't really a sea change or new information. It really just reaffirmed or clarified in some aspects a firm's fiduciary duty. But it really did spell out, I think, with examples, a firm's duty of care and duty of loyalty. And so we continue, as we have for years, to be looking at fiduciary responsibility as part of our examination program.
Right. So, Anil, you've had, if not a front row seat, a close seat for 60 firms preparing a Form CRS. What do you think is going on there with the people who are trying to handle that question about disciplinary information?
Well, I think it's to the extent that there are some difficulties with people getting it right, I think it's because they're used to thinking of disciplinary disclosures in a particular way. They're used to thinking of it the way that it's treated on Part 1A of Form ADV or on Part 2A. And certainly for those two parts of Form ADV, the questions are pretty heavy duty. It's, have you committed a crime? Have you been sued by the SEC? Have you been sued by an SRO? And of course, a lot of firms are not in that boat, and so they think of themselves as being sort of free of disciplinary disclosures. But CRS is a different beast, and I think the Commission and the staff have been crystal clear on it. If you have a ding on your U4, if you've got a mark on your IAPD or broker check report, you're going to have to answer yes on CRS to the disciplinary question. And it's a very low threshold. It's very easy to get a mark on your U4. But I think that is the disconnect. People are thinking about the disciplinary item by standards, by the Part 1 and Part 2 standards rather than the new Part 3.
Right. So as a practical matter, how have you been able to help, your colleagues and the firms that you oversee roll this out and understand how to get the form done the right way?
Well, I guess the first task was to digest the release, and I don't think there's any substitute for actually reading the release and understanding it. There's always, in these major rules, a lot of nuances that you don't get if you're just reading a summary. And then we pushed out guidance, before the compliance day to our firms. We had what we call a lunch and learn, where we had an outside counsel come in and do a webinar for all our firms, and then we fielded questions. We issued an FAQ guidance and did, everything we can think of really to educate the firms. And then in the wake of the filings of CRS, we're going through all the forms and just making sure that there's nothing that we spot that would be an issue for the staff.
Right. Michelle, in our pre-call, you yourself mentioned the importance of having procedures and of thinking of Form CRS as a year-round exercise. Any insights you can offer from your experience helping clients?
Yeah, I think that there's two big takeaways that at least my clients have experienced. The first one was, really thinking about on a continuous basis, does Form CRS need to get updated? As I'm making updates to my 2A, I've got to always think about, has there been some type of material change that would trigger the Form CRS being updated as well? And I think as a result of having only four, what I would call the four corners of the document, to get a lot of different disclosure information related to services, your compensation arrangements, your fees and the like, folks have had to think about, how do I articulate this in a concise fashion that's transparent, but is robust enough so that the end reader can understand it. And I think that has helped us as an industry think about the way that we are disclosing things to our clients and that transparency. And I know there was a lot of questions about the PPP loan, if and where do I disclose it? How do I disclose it? How do I make sure that folks are aware of financial conditions? So those were some of the big challenges. The other thing was just operationally, dependent upon how your firm is structured, who is responsible for delivering the Form CRS and when. So a big help has been not only the training and the education, and not of the compliance team, but of operations and the advisors, so that if there is a new account type, such as a IRA rollover, I have to remember I don't necessarily need to deliver the 2A. The client already has that, but I do have to deliver the Form CRS. And so that's just a change in the operational procedures. And so what I've seen folks do is literally have a checklist that can easily be referenced on the desktop so that it's constantly top of mind.
Right. I think one overarching takeaway is clear, which is that the form remains a programmatic priority for the commission as a whole. This is the disclosure leading edge of what was probably the most important SEC rulemaking of the past 3 or 4 years, the combined best interest and fiduciary interpretation. The staff clearly has been taking it very seriously all across the commission, including the examination staff. It remains a priority going forward. The advantage we all have, though, now is most of a year's worth of experience behind us. You have the risk alert from the staff, and you have the Form CRSs from a number of your peer firms that you can review. I think here, more than most other areas of compliance, the idea that compliance is an iterative process where you learn from past iterations and continually improve is true. To that point, Kristin, you mentioned in the pre-call there might be some resources that you could direct the audience to help them think more about their Form CRS obligations.
Right. No, so you mentioned the risk alert, Mark, which I would highly recommend folks take a look at. There's a separate risk alert for Form CRS as there is for regulation best interest on the broker-dealer side. And then there are a number of resources that are available on the SEC.gov website. There's a small entity guide that exists for both the Form CRS requirements as well as for regulation best interest. And there's a mailbox that folks can write into, IABD questions at SEC.gov. We got a number of questions, I think, pre-compliance date. But if there are kind of bespoke or unique questions that you have for your firm, you can certainly utilize that mailbox. And then there are a number of FAQs that our policy divisions have put out, both Division of Investment Management and Trading and Markets. And so I think the SEC.gov site really has a wealth of resources if you just plug in either Form CRS or Regulation Best Interest, and it should pull up a number of the materials that I mentioned, as well as the link for that particular email box.
So that's terrific. We're about halfway through the program, so I want to read to you the single most important thing you're going to hear today, which is the code word for CLE. I'll have another one at the end of the program, but today's CLE code word, there are two, but the first one is exams, EXAMS. This is not a trick question, exams. So now that we're halfway through, let's go to our next set of focus areas. And really, Form CRS is a perfect segue to the larger regulation best interest and fiduciary interpretation initiative. Of course, this is an advisor panel, so we won't really dwell on regulation best interest other than to note that to really understand what the staff is doing, you need to understand that this is a comprehensive rulemaking that cuts across industries and division. It affects not just investment advisors, but broker-dealers as well. And I think I really do believe this is the most important SEC rulemaking initiative of the past 3 or 4 years. And it isn't and shouldn't be a surprise that it remains an examination priority for Kristin's colleagues on the staff. I can tell you anecdotally from looking at examination letters that my clients are receiving the staff is unquestionably drilling down on the particulars of fiduciary interpretation. You're seeing questions, for example, about how retail investment advisors are documenting that they are gathering the information that they need to understand an investor's profile, which is a key input into the suitability process that the SEC outlined in the interpretation. But, rather than take it from me, why don't we hear from Kristin? Can you tell us what the staff is focusing on here? And if I realize it's early days in this significant rulemaking initiative, but any insights you can share with us about what you've learned from the examinations?
So I think I'll focus primarily on the fiduciary interpretation, just because I think we've got an investment advisor audience. And I will say on the regulation best interest front, as Mark noted, our broker-dealer program has been extremely active and working with other agencies such as other SROs around this as well. And we did put out a risk alert kind of highlighting the areas that we would cover as part of our regulation best interest exams. We did an initial set of kind of overview exams in the regulation best interest front, and now we're doing deeper dive exams, I think really digging in, as Mark said, to some of the documentation, looking at compliance programs and if they've been adapted, to handle the new rules and requirements. And so that's kind of a thumbnail and an overview of the regulation best interest work that we're doing. And I think there will be more to come. Certainly as we gather more information from the industry, we'll try to get that out to the public. And the regulatory roundtable in October was still kind of early days, but that was one attempt, to really report on what we were seeing so far. On the fiduciary interp, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I don't know that we see that on the advisor side really as a big sea change. I think it really reaffirmed and clarified some aspects of the fiduciary standard for advisors. But fiduciary duty is something that we're looking at pretty much in each and every examination. And I think the interp does a great job of spelling out duty of care and duty of loyalty and giving some specific examples. I would highly recommend folks read it as releases go, or as interpretations go, I guess. It's a much shorter read. It's not hundreds of pages, it's about 40. And it does have some, very good examples in it and just some factors for firms to consider. But I think, our bread and butter on the advisor side is really looking at conflicts on the duty of loyalty side. It's something that we look at in most of our examinations, just to ensure that firms are kind of managing, mitigating, disclosing their conflicts of interest. And then we are also looking at suitability on the duty of care side, suitability and best interest of recommendations to advisory clients, whether it's an account type or a particular type of investment program. And we also, kind of judge that against or look at that against the type of client, that and the scope of the advisory contract. So again, I don't think that the fiduciary interp is a sea change and really changed the way that we look at things substantially. But I'd be curious, I don't know, to hear from for folks who are dealing directly with clients, if you view the advice that you're giving as different, or not to put it back on you, but I'm curious to get that feedback if you really viewed it as a sea change, because I think for us, again, it's helpful, and I think it's a very helpful interpretation, but in a lot of ways it documents many of the things that we were focused on already.
That's a fair question, and I'll take it. Which is, I don't think directionally there's a surprise in the fiduciary interpretation. Advisors have known they're fiduciaries; they've got a duty of care and loyalty for many years, and the industry prides itself, I think, on upholding those standards. I think what's new about the fiduciary interpretation is the degree of specificity that the SEC attached to fulfilling some of the particulars around those duties, particularly the duty of suitability and the disclosure and mitigation of conflicts of interest. And of course, that's where the SEC spent the bulk of its time in the interpretation. I don't need to relitigate what's in there, other than to also commend the release to all of our audience themselves. But the reason why I think it's especially important for a panel like this is all of these details are opportunities for you as compliance professionals to document specifics, to be able to show the best side of your firm. So to the extent you don't already have a tight process, for example, for gathering your clients' investment profile information, such as their objectives and their financial situation, and relating that back to investment objectives, investment strategies, the release is an opportunity for you to do that. And I can tell you there are a range of practices across the industry about how to do that. But what's relevant for an examination audience is documenting it is key to being able to demonstrate to the staff that you're fulfilling these new, more particular obligations. So, Michelle, I think you've been working in the trenches alongside me on these issues. How are your clients thinking about and tackling this documentation question?
Thanks, Mark. It's interesting because I think that, through the years, we all know that we have to do what's in the best interest of clients. The challenge has come to the key word that you just focused on, which is the documentation. So when they're looking at account types or program types, in the past, in my opinion, I've seen a lot of analysis being done, but that analysis was not necessarily documented to memorialize. This was the rationale as to why a client, is going into a particular program type, such as a wrap fee program or a particular strategy, or why, are we evaluating mutual fund shares, and are we selecting that which is in the best interest of the client, and what analysis was taken to get us and lead us to there. So it really comes back to those conflicts, the fees and expenses, compensation arrangements. And I think as compliance professionals, taking a step back to say, not only have we thought about it, we've documented it, and we are keeping track of this. We've actually developed an internal control system to better assess, are we truly doing what's in the best interest of the client? So in other words, we're not just saying it, we're actually testing it to ensure that we're doing it.
Right. Anil, you have, I think, some interesting insights here, both from helping your client firms deal with it, but at the same time, you've sat in the commissioner's and in the chairman's office too. So what insights could you offer for the audience?
Well, I think the fiduciary interpretation was an interesting document. For one thing, it's a statement of the commission, and it's always nice to get the commission's words in black and white when you can, instead of guessing at it. I do think, I agree with Kristin, it was a clarification of existing law. It didn't cut any new ground. And so, for that reason, happily, it's consistent with how we've been advising firms for a long time. And we didn't really have to change course. I do think, though, there were a couple of aspects of the interpretation that were particularly helpful and helpful to have in black and white. One is the interpretation's approach to conflicts. I think it clarifies that it's not just a question of disclosure. It's not like you can just come up with a new business practice and say, okay, what kind of disclosure do I need to make this okay? That's not the right way to go about it. I think the first question you have to ask is this practice fundamentally unfair? Because if it is, there's no amount of disclosure. There's nothing you can say that's going to make it okay. But beyond that, you have to ask yourself, look, can I avoid this conflict somehow? If I can't avoid it, is there a way to mitigate it so that the impact on clients is less? And only at that point do you really get to the question of, okay, I've done what I can to avoid or mitigate. Now I need to think about what kind of disclosure can I put in place here to make this okay? And the sort of second point is an extension of that line of thinking, and that is, what does it really mean to get client consent? Just because you have a client sign a piece of paper or agree to something on the phone isn't enough. The consent has to be informed. The client has to know, what are the pros and cons of this thing that my advisor is asking me to do. What are the risks? What's the danger to me? And only really if the client understands those risks can you really say that you've gotten their informed consent, and that informed consent is what you need to engage in a business practice without the SEC knocking on the door.
That's very helpful, Anil. So let's move on to our second topic here. And Michelle, this is really one that you've spent a lot of time dealing with. The supervisory issues and risks that come from multiple offices have always been there, but COVID and work from home, of course, have accentuated those. So, and the staff actually gave us a risk alert on this point that, essentially stands for this proposition: the same issues, but harder. So what are the main risks you're seeing here recently, and how can you help the audience think about addressing those risks going forward?
Sure. And I think that there was a really interesting statistic in the risk alert, which really highlights the challenge of having multiple branch offices, in that, truly, especially in the independent contractor model or what have you, or if you've just gone through a recent acquisition, folks don't necessarily do things the same way as the home office. And so that's the challenge. And that as you're going out to these offices, for example, the way that one might compute advisory fees and expenses, it could actually be different from office to office. I've seen offices where, one group will define a household one way and aggregate accounts for purposes of tiered fee breakpoints one way, where another office is doing it a completely different methodology or extending the definition of household. And so I think the challenge that firms have is that you have to think about policies and procedures from an enterprise level, and not as a multiple, I'm going to have this set of procedures for this office, but if I go clear across the country, we'll have a different set. And so the challenges really came into 50% of the policies and procedures that the staff happened to review for, I believe there were 40 investment advisors in geographically dispersed locations. When they reviewed it, 50% were not necessarily representative of the practices that were in place by these organizations. So if it said, for example, we will conduct training across the board, training wasn't conducted. Or if the home office was not receiving advertisements back to review for disclosures, there were material omissions that were missing, or folks were, citing additional credentials when they really lacked those credentials. So there was just a lack of controls. There was also a lack of books and records from the standpoint of, if compliance isn't receiving, for example, personal trading records, it's really hard to test for front running and the like, or to see, is there a gap in the compliance program? The other gap and challenge that we have is training, and especially during COVID, I think that one of the things that have become readily apparent is that as we communicate not only with our clients, but with one another internally at the advisory firm, we have to over-communicate. So what the staff found was that even simple things like, if I serve as a trustee for a client account, I didn't realize that would potentially trigger the custody role. They just weren't aware of it. And I think that, the more that we have these multiple offices, especially when we're not able to go on site and conduct those branch office examinations, or to conduct live training to really discern what kind of issues are there that folks might not understand the requirements of the compliance program, that's been the biggest challenge. So I think, in order to address that, a lot of that comes to, where have we deployed compliance technologies in order to survey that activity, to identify red flags and trends? Have we really articulated and established a clear protocol for what kind of compliance records must be received from compliance? How are we testing to ensure that we're actually getting the books and records that we need so that those oversights can be done? And are we spending enough truly training our folks to ensure that they understand what they need to do and how they need to do it, and looking at the uniformity of controls across the enterprise?
Perennial lessons, but I think ones that our experiences of the past year have really, really underscored. So let's move to the next topic here on this slide, which is the mysterious and magical letters ESG, which have the mystical power of meaning virtually different things to every person who reviews them. This is not an ESG panel, and it's not the time for us to discuss what ES and G are and how you can be a better ESG firm. Rather, I just want to make two observations. The first is that ESG is probably one of the biggest secular trends that we as a firm have been seeing. Large-scale shift in investor mindsets that is working its way throughout the entire industry. And you've, I'm sure, seen countless firms roll out ESG products or recognize the ESG nature of a number of their existing products. That's observation number one. It's real and it's here, and the SEC has not been ignoring this trend. Some of what they've been doing has been under the radar screen through advisory committees and speeches, but it's been clear to us for some time that the examination staff, and this includes also the mutual fund disclosure examination staff, have been focused on ESG issues for some time. Over the past couple of years, run out of the LA office, there's been a series of exams. I don't want to quite call them sweeps. They have, to a large degree, focused on ESG issues. And it's clear to us that the staff views a significant role for the securities laws and for the SEC here, because you're making representations to investors about how you manage money. And of course, matching what you do with what you say is a key principle of the securities laws. I always call this the Horton hatches an egg principle: say what you mean and mean what you say, if you want to boil it down to its essence. But in a little bit more detail, in my experience, the staff in examinations has been focusing on your disclosures and marketing materials, your investment process, your policies and procedures, and what your portfolio actually is, and has been trying to make sure that they all match each other. And I've seen deficiencies where they pointed out by the staff where they haven't. Again, say what you mean and mean what you say. And if you don't, that is potentially an issue. But Kristin, it's also a priority in this year's examination priority document. Is there anything you can share with us about how the staff is approaching ESG in examinations?
So that's a tough summary to follow, Mark, because you hit so many of the points that I would make now, and I think made them very well. I think like any other investment strategy in ESG, we've all seen the articles, we've all seen the proliferation of products, I think, across so many different firm types, whether it's private funds or mutual funds or in separately managed account strategies. So many advisors are offering ESG strategies, whether they're calling them ESG or SRI or impact or faith-based, or there are, as you mentioned, a myriad of names, and we're not going to define them all here. But I think like any other strategies, we are looking to see whether the disclosure and the marketing around the strategies matches up with what's happening in practice. I think you hit it on the head. We're not targeting ESG because we think it's problematic or bad at its core. That's certainly not the case. And we encourage innovation, but we just want to, like any other strategy, want to ensure that disclosure matches up with practice. And so just as an example, if a firm is stating that they use certain or they exclude certain stocks, based on the strategy from their portfolio, do they have mechanisms in place to ensure that those securities are being excluded from the portfolio? And is that kind of checking going on an ongoing basis? Or if there are positive inclusions, if there's sort of positive screening that's going on, and certain securities are included based on those positive screens, are there ways to test and track that and ensure that that's happening? And often, I think, as you noted, in our examinations, we're sometimes finding that policies and procedures maybe are not in place for that type of tracking to occur. And our Los Angeles office, as you noted, has conducted a number of exams in this space, but I think just given the number of firms that are engaged in ESG investing, more and more we're conducting exams all across the country, and we prioritized looking at ESG strategies in our 2020 priorities. As you noted, they're also prioritized again in 2021. So I think, firms can expect to see that we'll be doing more exams in this space. And again, just like we would for any other stated strategy, be looking at marketing materials as well as disclosures. So I think it goes back to Michelle's great point about documentation. I think having good documentation in place to support that the reviews or the procedures that are stated or represented are actually taking place is really helpful when we come in to do an exam.
Really insightful as always, Kristin. Michelle, I know you've helped clients with these exams also. Any thoughts you can share with the audience about how to get ahead of the staff and be able to respond.
Yeah, there were three notables that my clients experienced from the Los Angeles office as they were going through their examinations. And the first was just that, as we touched upon, so I won't be redundant, but on the policies and procedures, how we really established the criteria for which we are really holding ourselves out as providing socially responsible portfolios. And what does that mean across the enterprise? And how are we going to disclose that? How is that going to appear in our marketing collateral? What are our standards? And how is that being carried forth in both our trading practices as well as proxy voting? And the second area that I just want to touch upon, Mark, really focuses on that marketing collateral. We had one instance where, and I think this is very common, the firm happened to be a certified B corporation. And in that instance, the staff was, they looked at various areas such as, first of all, are you truly certified? And show us the documentation of how you went through that certification process. And then secondarily, how did you disclose this to your clients? Did you define for them that certified B Corp meets the highest standard of verified social environmental performance, transparency, accountability, and really what does that mean? What are those standards? And articulate that in plain English. And so I think that, the two takeaways are you have to prove that you're doing what you said you were going to do, and then you have to document it and ensure that we've got controls in place in all of the various documents and ways that we're communicating with clients to ensure that they understand what it means when we say, in that example, we're a certified B corporation.
So that's a perfect segue to the last point I want to make on this slide, which is that marketing and advertising are a perennial SEC examination topic, whether or not they are in the priorities. And the SEC periodically publishes risk alerts about what they're finding on these topics. I would just point out that the new marketing rule is going to go into effect. We just saw today a signal that it's going to be published in the Federal Register tomorrow. You've got 18 months moving forward, but because it's such a big rule and a big sea change, it's worth pointing out that it's not all uncontroversial. And two commissioners at the time it was adopted sent, maybe warning is too strong a word, but we can take it this way. The rule will likely place advertising at the center of examination enforcement priorities for years to come. That's a statement that speaks for itself on this panel. And they point out in particular their concerns about the rule's provisions on hypothetical performance. So again, I think that speaks for itself as well. So another subject that's been on the SEC examination priorities for a number of years now, and it's in this year's priorities as well, is a focus on private funds. I know another panel is going to touch on this, so we don't need to dwell on this in any great detail other than to point out that the SEC published a risk alert again on what they're finding in examinations in the middle of last year. The risk alert read like a summary of most of the enforcement actions that they brought in the middle part of the last decade focused on private fund managers, a series of issues with undisclosed conflicts of interest, allocation of fees and expenses, and material non-public information controls that I'm sure will be a focus area for the division going forward. But I mean, Kristin, can you take a minute and comment on what you think the staff is going to be looking for in these exams moving forward?
Absolutely. And private funds they're a really important part. Private fund managers are an important part of the portfolio we cover. It's almost 36% of our advisor population that manages one or more private funds. And so we do have a dedicated private funds unit that has staff kind of spread across the country, and they work on thematic initiatives and help support the regional offices. But in all of our regional offices, we also have staff who cover our private fund population just because of its size. And so we did highlight a couple of priorities, newer priorities. I think some coming out of the market volatility. We're going to be looking, of course, at liquidity at certain types of firms. So I'll just mention the new priorities for fiscal 21. So real estate, firms that may have been harder hit, I think, by the pandemic. So those that may have investments in commercial real estate and certain other structured products that may have experienced some impacts. And so we're just looking there for any kind of preferential redemption activity, looking at liquidity, just to get a handle on kind of what is going on with those advisors. But our risk alert, which really represented, I think, culmination of a number of years worth of work, including recent exams, did, as you mentioned, and as noted on the slide, it covered kind of the bread and butter areas that we look at many of our private fund managers. And conflicts is certainly, an important area. And as you noted, a number of the specific examples we gave have been covered in prior enforcement actions. I think what's sometimes surprising is we continue to see issues around, undisclosed fees and expenses, and some of the fees and expenses that have been, of the type that where there have been enforcement activity in the past. So I would, encourage firms in the private fund space, to take a look at the risk alert. And again, as we've said, I think with a lot of different topics, ensure that what's being disclosed and what's stated in, the firm's documents is actually what's happening in practice. Because often we'll come in and, question a certain fee or a certain expense that we see that isn't always covered in the disclosure that's made to investors. So it's just something to keep in mind. Or if a practice changes or additional conflicts pop up, it's just something to be looking at on a dynamic basis. I think it's, most helpful, and having compliance involved, if there are significant changes that are being made. So conflicts, and then fees and expenses, so that's, we've touched on, I guess on the conflicts front, one other important factor that we look at is just allocation of investment opportunities. I think that's, really an important area that we cover in many of our examinations. And then controls around material non-public information. And in a very quick overview, I think, our private funds unit, as well as other groups, have been focused on looking at firms taking in alternative data. And that may come up later on the private funds panel. But I think just ensuring that firms have good controls around the intake and the due diligence, as that important information that, often drives investment decision making, is being brought into the firm, just like any other types of information. And so that's, kind of non-traditional sources that firms may be using. So I'll stop there, I guess, in the interest of time.
No, thank you, Kristen. So our last point. First, I want to give you the second CLE code word, which is exams 2. It's the same one as before, but with the number 2 at the end of it, EXAMS 2. Secondly, while this slide is about LIBOR, I'll point out that Pete Driscoll actually covered in some detail what the staff is thinking on LIBOR already. Rather than repeat what Pete has to say, I'd like to pivot and ask Michelle and then Anil to offer some closing observations, just a simple takeaway for the audience about exam preparation.
Sure, and
Michelle?
thank you, Mark. There's been so many things that have been said and shared today with regards to best practice and tips. And so this is what I wanted to leave with you. During the pandemic, and as we've shifted to correspondent exams, I can tell you that there's been a difference in the examination experience, if you will, by those firms that have elected to do video teleconference with the staff, and to really focus on, as many of you do, what I call the opening ceremonies, the PowerPoint presentation, to show the staff not only this is the firm, this is what we do, this is what we don't do, but focus on what you did during COVID and really explain, how did I communicate with clients? How did I inform them about how to reach personnel? How did investments change at all? And I think that helps to set a great tone as to the culture of compliance within the organization and how you've responded to the pandemic. And the second thing I'll leave you with is that last week I received a call from a rather large client of ours that a majority members of the team had actually come down with COVID, okay, even at this late stage. And, the question became, from a succession planning standpoint, have we truly adequately cross-trained all the personnel? We didn't expect this to happen. We didn't expect this many people to be impacted. And I think that firms need to take another step back to just ensure that those controls are in place, especially for the smaller advisors.
Very useful stuff, Michelle. Thanks. Anil, you're going to get the last word here.
Well, thanks. I'd like to echo what Michelle said, actually, about the opening ceremonies. That we've advised for some time that firms should voluntarily prepare a meet the firm deck and share that with the staff right up front. And the reason we do it is because when the staff comes in, they don't know you at all, and it's going to take them a while to kind of figure things out. If you can help them to understand who you are at a very basic level, who your officers are, what your investment methodology is, I think it just gets the exam off on the right foot, and it makes them feel a little bit more comfortable about what they're seeing in the documents and in the Q&A during the onsite. I think, too, another point I might make about exams is I think people tend to think of them traditionally as a burden, and if you're weak on compliance, as a threat. And I think those things are true. But another side of exams is that it's a real opportunity, because here's a chance for you to hear directly from your primary regulator on what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. If you prepare properly, if you're strong on compliance, if you do a mock audit to get you familiar with the process, these exams can be a real gift to you, because it gives you a chance to help your compliance program evolve and really become state of the art, which I think benefits you in winning clients, in keeping clients, and in sort of being able to run your business without disruption. So I think you should look at exams in a more textured way.
That's great, Anil. So I want to thank the audience for their time and attention today. I want to thank my co-panelists for sharing so many useful and interesting insights with the audience. May you all stay safe and well. Thanks again today.